Okay, hello everybody. First of all, my sincerest apologies that we are late. So Helsinki and Stockholm are close to each other mentally, but sometimes apparently not virtually. We have some technical problems in reaching to our other person of conversation, so we are trying to fix it, and really my sincerest apologies for this. So my name is Katja Lindroos. I am the co-founder of Nordic City Making Week, and we had the pleasure to collaborate with Creative Bureaucracy. Just 2 weeks ago, we had our own festival here in Helsinki and Vantaa, and we discussed co-governance, many topics that are, of course, very much present in this Creative Bureaucracy Festival. And Nordic City Making is all about creating bridges, so across cities, countries, communities. And therefore, we thought that it would be fantastic to have here two people from different cities, but also who are actually as persons, real bridge builders, who have connected to many different roles as bureaucrats, but also as people working very much from entrepreneurial side, in media, in different forms of connecting to the public causes. And we are starting now with Pekka, and we are I think in the same city, but we're still remotely here. So great to see you like this.
You too, Katja.
Nice to have you. So this is Pekka Sauri, and like a person that is very familiar to many people who have a history in Helsinki and a presence. And I think you are still stopped in the streets and asked questions about Helsinki and the public.
That is true, yeah. That's true, yeah. I tried to tell them that I stopped working for the city more than 3 years ago, and they say, yeah, but nobody answers.
No, they don't. We don't let you go. So just to you have a very, of course, extensive career, and it's very difficult to summarize. But what we are going to talk today about very much is communication, and how you have been innovating in the form of how to communicate with a bigger public. So let's start by actually addressing the title that Charles Landry gave you, which is that you are the Twitter mayor. So can you tell a little bit about how you became the Twitter mayor?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it's like most big things, it started out as an accident, more or less. And this happened basically in 2010, 10 years ago. I'd been on Twitter earlier, but and other forms of social media. But then we had a tremendous snowstorm, a blizzard in Helsinki, first time in, well, about 10 years since the turn of the millennium. And most people had forgotten how it is when we have a blizzard.
Yeah.
And I got more than 500 personal emails demanding responsibility from the city. And I was wondering what to do with these 500 emails. I ended up replying to each one, but I obviously concluded that it can't go on like this. So I started communicating on Twitter and also communicating before the event, as it were. So before the following winter, I started telling people how the snow works are organized in the city and in which order the streets are plowed and whatever. And the following winter was pretty much almost as bad, but I only got a fraction of the personal complaints I'd had the previous year. And people said that it's really good that the city sort of communicates or gives out information on social media before the actual problem starts, so people are prepared.
Yeah.
And I coined an idiom that if most people are sort of prepared to cope with everything if they know beforehand. But if they don't know it beforehand, they don't cope with anything at all. And there's a big difference there. So that's how it started, pretty much.
Yeah. So you're indeed like good things happen by accident often, but anyway, you had, of course, a really extensive following, and you became pretty much a person who people could sort of reach to with all kinds of things. So can you a little bit tell about that? Because I've sometimes seen, for example, the tweets that have been sent to you and still are sent to you, which are quite striking because they didn't really have always to do so much with your official role.
That is true, but what happened was that when people noticed that I usually sort of I answer questions and also in public, like on social media. So if they hadn't got an answer from some other sort of administration or authority, and then they posted it to me, and they said, well, nobody else seems to answer, so can you please work this out? And which was a bit sort of difficult because it's obvious that I just couldn't I can't know of every branch of administration because I was only responsible for one particular one.
Yeah.
But I concluded that it's not enough that I tell them to go to the social services or the education department or whatever. It's not good enough. People don't want to be sort of told to go elsewhere. Mm. So I usually try to work it out. I mean, I told people that I'll be back as soon as I can. Then I contacted the department or office in question and found out what the problem was. And then I went back to Twitter and gave the information I had. And obviously it was a good exercise for myself. I got to know a lot about the different sort of branches of the city organization.
Yeah, it's quite striking to be some kind of general information center. But if you think about now, of course, in hindsight, you can see that also your role in the city organization, the city of Helsinki, was quite let's say it was a turning point, more or less. I think we can all agree that the city has, in many ways, like everywhere I think around the world, opened up more to the public and become more maybe enabling. So how important do you think now that this, if you think about just your role as a communicator, was this just as a message to the citizens of how does the city want to interact, or were you very alone, so-called, in the way you were?
I certainly started out alone, and I first thought that should I sort of go through the official channels and should I discuss it with my colleagues and so on, or maybe sort of set up a working group or whatever. But then I realized that the working group would still be working today. So I thought that it's much easier just do it yourself and see what happens. And that's what I did. And all the feedback practically, or 99.9% of the feedback has been positive. And people seem to be very happy that the city actually provides them with information about how the city works and how particular situations are dealt with and so on. But sometimes I had the feeling that when I was pretty busy with this stuff, so I sometimes got the feeling that other partners of the city sort of thought that it's okay that Pekka is doing this, so we don't have to. So I was kind of lightning conductor, more or less. But most other departments, apart from those in my responsibility, they did pick it up. Some with more success, some with less. But and this is the situation. I mean, I think it's pretty normal that not all organizations are as good as each other. Some have much more courage. Some are much more sort of progressive, and some are not. So I think that's pretty natural.
Yeah. But indeed, like you mentioned, there has been now some years already that you have not been in that role, and also actually the you wouldn't have now at the moment that role because the organizational change that has happened in the city of Helsinki would have made you more like a less maybe as a bureaucrat or a civil servant and more as a politician. But if you think about now, you are now, for example, you are professor of practice at the University of Helsinki, and you are a specialist in communications. And this is now the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. So what is, from your point of view, what are the important things? You have also written actually a book on social media and the public sector. So what are the most important points that you would like to share in a way as lessons that you have learned in how to communicate in these days with the public?
I think that the most important lesson is to break the rules. That social media gives us an opportunity to communicate in real time in two directions and with multiple participants each given time. Yeah. And it's possible to use all these dimensions together. And this is what public organizations, the public sector should also do. And there are indeed some public authorities in Finland that are sort of leading the way, apart from myself, of course, but sort of other administrations, like the Finnish tax authority. They're very innovative and creative in their communications. And I think it's a pretty good achievement if we take into account that most messages people get from the tax authority are unwanted. And it's usually sort of bad news when you get a message from the tax authority. But the tax authority has also assumed a sort of proactive mode, that they inform the residents or the citizens about when taxes are going to be collected and how to fill out your tax returns.
Yep.
And even that, apart from the communication, their net presence is very easy. It's very sort of practical. So if you want to check your tax declaration, it's very easy to do it on the internet, on the web page, and then there in the lower right-hand corner, there's a chat. So if you encounter problems while trying to fill out the form or whatever, you just sort of chat with whoever's there to sort of ask the question. I think it's brilliant. It couldn't be any better, really. And they are sort of the communications also, the media, like TV and other media. It's extremely entertaining and innovative and funny.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different world compared with, well, let's say 15 years ago,
yeah,
when everything had to be done by sort of paper forms, which you had to sort of carry to the tax office. And then when there was a figure missing, you got a letter a week later saying that you had to sort of correct that figure and so on. Now you can do it in real time, and that's a very good example, I think.
Exactly. So this movement to be really real time, which of course you experienced very first hand with your experience with social media, is a big challenge. And of course we can talk a little bit after a while also about what the impact is now when we are living in a very strange time and a lot of our communication happens via these devices. I would like to, before we start with Frederick, ask one more question from you, Pekka, and we will then get back at the end a bit conversing. So when you think about now what you have, because you have indeed, you have had an important following, and of course one of the big questions, my question is two-part, is like, how were you able to move your followers to follow the city of Helsinki or other people that have succeeded you in your role, or if you did at all? And the other thing is that, do you think that there are groups of people among the citizens that you did not reach? And what would be ways of reaching also those groups?
Well, those are big questions. First, I was a bit. I was wondering when I left the city hall. I thought I might. I had probably sort of 75,000 Twitter followers, and I was pretty sure that now the figure starts going down when I'm not no more a sort of public figure in that sense. But no, I mean no, it's been, the number of followers has been increasing still, even though I'm not in a city.
Yeah.
I'm not deputy mayor anymore, and now I have almost 117,000 Twitter followers, which is pretty good considering I'm just a sort of puny professor of practice at the university. But whether there were people who,
We have some kind of distraction in sound.
yeah.
No.
Yeah. Obviously, there are people who are not using social media or are not even using this. And I didn't reach those people. But I tried to find ways to reach those people sort of indirectly, because at a lot of times, whatever I put on the internet, on the social media, got quoted in the traditional media, radio or paper,
yeah.
paper newspapers, and so on. I tried to elsewhere. So there were more media than just social media that I tried to reach people through. But still, it's still a matter of I think it's education and also a matter of personal economy. People with low education, they have also take part in the conversation. And also, obviously, if you don't have the money, I mean, you can't afford the technology to reach other people.
Yeah, so it's in a way just because we had some sound issues, so I heard you maybe better than some others. So indeed, the challenge, of course, is of that you are always reaching to people who have probably already quite capable of finding information. Yes, and the big challenge is that how to reach to people who don't have the same tools and maybe the ability to address and maybe even communicate in that way.
That's right. That's right. And it's also a matter of language, and I don't only mean your native language, but the type of language you use. So, because I think most people on social media, at least in Finland, they have an academic qualification.
Yeah.
And it creates a special language, and sometimes it's probably difficult to follow the conversation for people who don't have that qualification. So there are sort of equality issues like this.
Yeah, but you can only solve of course, one thing at a time. But thank you, Pekka. We will get back to talking a bit more. And I will now take Frederick. So hey, Frederick, you are in Stockholm. And I think we solve the barriers now of technology, hopefully. Hello.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think these Corona times will teach us that you are very vulnerable to technology. I'm actually on paternity leave for another couple of weeks, and my daughter broke my computer. So I had to run into a neighbor, and I'm actually on my neighbor's computer now. So all ended well, and here I am.
Tell us about how important neighbors are and locality, that you have a neighbor.
They are indeed.
We are really happy to have you here. And once more, those who have been watching and wondering why were we away, so our apologies. It's all up to us that we should have been maybe more suspicious, but we are great here. And indeed, Fredrik Lindstal, so we had a pleasure to talk like this almost exactly a couple of weeks ago when we had Nordic City Making Week, and we talked very much then about participation and placemaking. And as this is now Creative Bureaucracy Festival, so of course it's very interesting to introduce your very wide scope of perspectives, how you look at the public administration, and then also the the point of view of a citizen. So can you a little bit tell about yourself and how did you become involved with the cities?
Absolutely. I'd like to say when I think about working in city, I love the name creative bureaucracy because I think that's really on the spot. Because I usually explain working with cities as it's the best board game you could ever play, but with the worst instructions that you could ever read.
It's interesting.
But I come sort of from an array of background, but I've been an entrepreneur all my life. I grew up in the restaurant business, but I was also a skateboarder. So I very much lived an urban lifestyle. I saw the streets from my own perspective being a skateboarder, and I worked late, finished at 1, 2 o'clock in the AM. And I just saw all these initiatives that one could make in a city, food markets, etc. And I decided that I wanted to be a part of it, but mostly I wanted to be a part of evolving a system where ideas come from those who live in cities. And from a political point of view, how can you find a system or regulation, if you wish, to amplify the voices of the people within cities? And also from my own entrepreneurial perspective is, can you become a placemaker? Can you create life and projects in cities and making them actually financially viable? Because it's all, I think freedom is an important word for a planner and a city maker. And I think if you can find a way to do it yourself, you've come a long way. So I started a company around that about 10 years ago, which I like to think of works with idea-based city planning, where we have our projects, for example, festivals, markets, and those kind of sort of soft cultural initiatives. But we also, and foremost, help others with plans. We help them with a sort of first contact with a city, filling out permits, insurance, financing, etc. And on the other hand, I've been a politician in Stockholm for about 10 years now. And up until last year, I was full-time as vice mayor to Stockholm with responsibilities of labor and integration. But I'm a part-time politician now. So with the same pair of eyes, I view the city from a placemaking perspective as a citizen, but also as an entrepreneur, but also as a politician. So on the one side, I'm trying to create long-term sustainable policy. And on the other hand, I just want to make fun stuff happen.
Yeah. What do you think, like when you would, because of course this kind of a double role, first of all, have to ask the most obvious, is there ever conflict of interest?
There is sometimes. Obviously, I see a project where I really, really want to work with it myself. I think I look at a space and think I can do amazing things with a space. But that's just the next week or the next year. But if I take a step back and look at that space and say, okay, what could this space be to the city of Stockholm in the long-term run? I often find myself sort of beaten by my political side because I am someone who thinks about general space in the long-term run. But the way I've personally solved it is that I work with my company outside of the Stockholm County. I work in other parts of Stockholm now because I want to avoid conflict, obviously. But my fingers are always itching, even when I read through sheets of bureaucracy papers, and I think to myself, oh, I could do that. But I have to contain myself every now and then.
Yeah, right. And you have also taken the role of a vice mayor or deputy mayor for a while. So how did that change your perspective in also looking at actually the role of bureaucrats and politicians in the city?
I think being a full-time politician and really sort of looking under the hood, so to speak, really understanding the ways of how policy work, but I think mostly how people working with policy work, is that I actually enjoy the sort of the pace at which bureaucracy works, that it's a lot slower than entrepreneurial work. And I think it has to be, because it's the way that it's the only way where you can reach as many people as possible to create as democratic systems and solutions as you can. So I actually, for me, watching and being part of full-time politics was actually a positive. That's on the one side. I also saw the gap between the everyday citizen and being a full-time politician grow during that period. I felt myself become more and more part of the political structure and less part of the grassroots placemaking culture, because I also saw the hurdles of bureaucracy that you had to overcome that I didn't have to think about not being a full-time politician. I think, for example, when you look at a plot of land in a city, which is obviously very desirable to build condos, to build industry, shops, retail, to build parks, preschools, etc. You have all these problems that a city needs to solve, and you have to look at the big picture. As a placemaker before, I could enjoy just looking at it from my perspective. And I think what I saw also is the lack of communication between a lot of parts of government, where you have, for example, a plot of land and you have all these interests. And I think, bottom line, it's better to do something with it than nothing. And I think through communication, through these sort of bodies of legislature, etc., I think that's really the key to making a city grow all the time. And a city, from a planning perspective, is bad at planning in the short term. And by short term, I mean, say, 3 to 5 to 7 years, but a lot better for planning for the future ahead, like 10, 20, 30 years. So if you can find a system to sort of bridge that gap, the minus 10 years, I think that's the key to designing vibrant cities.
No, that's a very interesting thing, this time span, because indeed I think that's also one of the very essential issues or even conflicts that there is between citizens and civil servants, is that you can't talk in the same time zone. So your citizens tend to think that when plans are presented to them, this will start happening basically tomorrow or at least next year. And they might be plans that are effective in 15, 20 years. And they both are really needed. So it's interesting that you mentioned communication, because of course Pekka was talking about communication and the sense of urgency that, for example, a blizzard or this kind of sudden, I'm afraid with these times that we are now living in with climate change, we will definitely have more of those sudden weather conditions. Suddenly you have to just react. But then the other issue is indeed what you mentioned, is communicating the long term and getting people on board on that. What kind of structures do you think are needed for that? You talked about that in between.
Yeah, well, I think you have to borrow structures from other worlds. I like using structures where basically you're forced to say yes to something. And then instead of, because it's so easy within bureaucracy to say no, because something you need to sort of cover your back in all the decisions that you're making. So whenever I was faced with a decision that had a long-term and a short-term perspective, I knew that the long-term advocates in the room would say no to a lot of things, because it would I wouldn't say shatter their plans, but it would change the perspective of their plans. So I made everyone in the room find a ways to initially say yes to a proposal, and then everyone in the room, for various reasons, that everyone had to find out why some way to say yes from their perspective. Then 20 minutes later, everyone in the room would say no from a perspective. So everyone would have to agree that, okay, so we should definitely do this. Then everyone should say, no, we're not going to do this because, etc., etc. And then this was hourly meeting. So 20 minutes yes, 20 minutes no, and then 20-minute consensus. And what I found was much more often the no-sayers were convinced that, okay, this might actually be doable. We can do our thing later, but these guys who want to create something now, it seems that they can do their thing while we consider what we should do later. And not only that, we sort of get a test bed to look into how our future plans could actually work. So I think it's about forcing people to step out of their comfort zone, but also be mindful of the long-term perspective, that they're holding a lot of responsibility in their hands. So if you can find a way to make yes and no people meet, the outcome tends to be more positive.
Yeah.
I know it's not the rigorous structure that most cities need, but it works.
Yeah. No, and it's also, of course, it requires people to be very human, as humans present, because you can't have that kind of conversation or negotiation if people are talking merely from their roles, because the no stay no and the yes stay yes. Yeah. It's a very good expression of, I think, of the slogan that Charles Landry was presenting today of this whole movement, which is going from a no because culture to yes if. So to create that space of negotiation. I would like to ask the same question actually that I asked Pekka, which is this constant issue of who is involved and who is the we who are at the table negotiating, and how do you work with that? In obviously with working in different roles, you also meet different people, but this, let's say, the other type of conflict of interest that you have always the same people who are maybe quite capable already of making their voice heard. How do you make the voice of those who are not heard a bit stronger?
I think that's I would say that probably the most important question when you're planning a city, because it's all about inclusion and how you can bring people to the table. I basically, what I do is I do a reverse power shift. Who has the real power to change, and who has who is affected by that change? And I reverse the process. I go to the people with the least amount of power and ask them, okay, let's say that we would do this. How would you feel about that? And I found ways of doing that. And it's about connecting with the community. I think that's what it boils down to. You need to be physically and geographically close to the people that are affected by what you want to do or achieve. I think if you do, and not only that, it's one thing to ask a person what they want to do. You have to remember to invite them continuously to the table. It's not if you go out into the community and ask what they feel about a certain building project, for example, they will have strong views probably. But if you continuously ask them to be part of the process of creating their own community, not only will the project be better, it will actually be I think it will tick all the boxes of democracy, etc. And so I think that's what it's all about, a reverse power shift. But be mindful not to just ask people's opinions, invite them to the actual table, and with the prospect that you might not be able to deliver the project that you would like to, because you learn things along the way which is prohibitive, but most of the times you're going to learn things along the way which strengthens whatever you want to do. So be mindful not just about asking, it's all about inclusion, and just asking people's opinions is not inclusion. It's an important step, but it's not the whole ball game.
Yeah, exactly. I would like to ask Pekka to join the conversation in also visually. Great to have you. So thank you, Fredrik, for really insightful, and you just seem also to, both of you, really, like I wrote down, like a bridge builders between citizens and city, because I think that's what you both have been actually essentially doing in your multiple roles, and in looking for both the urgency and some kind of, let's say, like structure or ability. But finally, I haven't heard from either of you any kinds of new systems. So you both talk very much about human contact. Pekka talked about just the ability to respond to a person, and to go to another person to ask and write a tweet back and say, here is your answer. And you are, Fredrik, talking about creating a power reverse and actually creating a conversation, which is also elementally just a human conversation. So do you think that this is something that actually this creative bureaucracy should be addressing more, that it is actually about the capacity to reach to people than to create some kind of structures? I know we are in the Nordics, we're structure builders, so we mostly start with systems. Pekka, what do you think?
I would say that the system or the political system we have, it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And I still think that representative democracy is a valid concept in democracy because, well, you know all the arguments pro and con, I guess, but provided that the conversation is open all the time and that the representatives of citizens or residents of a city, they are informed about I hate the word grassroots, but the residents' point of view and their experiences. And there has to be a constant open communication going on between representatives and let's say voters in this context. And I think most of the problems we do have in representative democracy stem from the fact that the representatives are out of touch with their voters. And it does demand sort of real-time contact with the residents because something might happen in an hour's time. And when I was deputy mayor, there were a few cases where I got woken up by a friend or colleague who said, "Hey, did you notice the headlines?" And I hadn't. And there was something that had happened sort of in connection with the city or my area of responsibility that I hadn't been aware of. And obviously the most sort of embarrassing situation is that you read about it in the papers and you were not aware of whatever was going on beforehand. And that's why I think it's essential that the channel stays open all the time. And obviously, the open channel does mean that there are people who get in touch, or there are people who I can get in touch with, or ask them what happens. And I try to make my political presence at the City Hall such that people regarding me as approachable.
Yep.
I was not fussy about bureaucracy. I was not formal. I tried to create the impression that I was easy to connect with, and it seemed to work. Obviously, I'm not the right person to evaluate this, but at least I felt that the communication culture was better when I left the city than when I entered the city office.
And I have to also add to this, to the spectators, that of course Pekka is known in Finland for, first of all, he has a background in psychology, and he was a very popular radio host, and night radio, when people called with quite let's say diverse issues, from being quite distressed to quite exotic storytelling, and you have been a listening ear to people for a long time, and that was of course also part of the accessibility that people would feel that you are a person to talk to. What about you, Frederick? What kind of thoughts come to your mind from what Pekka was saying?
No, I think I agree with a lot of what Pekka is saying. I think we actually have a pretty good system. The problem is perhaps that our system is a little too good. There are so many things in society that are just served to us in the Nordic countries. We have a functioning state, reasonably or very low corruption numbers, etc. And our cities and the countries work relatively well in comparison. But where it doesn't work all that well is when it comes to the idea of creativity. And that's coming back to the expression of creative bureaucracy, which I really like. For me, it's about channeling creativity. And bureaucracy is sort of a threshold for channeling creativity. So it's a lot about, for me, finding ways to translate the bureaucracy. For the system is there, and there's so many things that you can do with the public. We're blessed to have all this public space in the Nordic countries. We can go anywhere, we can go camping most places, etc., etc. But taking it to the next step and using it for example, for a festival or a market or come what may, you need to you need to make people aware that they can actually do all these things. So it's about channeling bureaucracy, channeling creativity and translating bureaucracy for me. And I think if you can't translate it to everyone, translate it to young people and they'll do the rest.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. This is an interesting thing, this what you say about things working almost too well. That's of course a very obvious criticism that the Nordic system sometimes receives, that the so-called nanny state, or if it is too much, you know, everything is organized already. Your entrepreneurial spirit is not stimulated in the way. People are not taking initiative themselves. But maybe a bigger question is indeed how agile it is when the society is changing, and when the sense of who we are in the society becomes more diverse. So Frederick, do you see that that's of course something that we in the Nordics discuss now a lot, and what we could learn from each other, certainly. But is there something that we could learn from, let's say, from other kind of cultures where there is more diversity and already more maybe complexity in the systems?
I think one example that I think about a lot is the inclusion and the interaction between people of ages. I think if you would go to a country in Southern Europe, for Spain, for example, you see interaction in the street between all ages. You can go into a bar or a pub or a shop or a cafe, and there would be 12-year-olds next to 20-year-olds, next to 60-year-olds, next to 90-year-olds. You have a completely different interaction between people. And if you were asked a bureaucrat, you could argue that it's about healthcare and how we live and how we take care of our elderly, etc. But I think there's something to be said about this public space being used by everyone in this context. And I think I really try and consider a lot why this doesn't happen naturally in Sweden, for example. Why, when I go into a cafe or a bar in my neighborhood, which is Södermalm, people are between 25 to 45, look relatively the same. Like, how do you create something apart from this homogeneous zone? And I think it boils down a little bit to inclusion, but I think you have to be active. You have to actively invite people of all generations to join. So that's something I think about a lot. And I think that's a big difference in other countries where the creativity and the interaction between people has failed in the Nordic countries. And I'm not entirely sure why.
Pekka, I have lost the visual connection to you, but I think I have a sound connection to you still. So do you think there are some kind of blind spots that in the Nordics we should be more discussing or aware of, and perhaps learn from others? Now I have also you.
Sorry, that was to me or Pekka?
Yeah, that was to you, Pekka. You hear me?
Now again, yeah. These things keep going off by themselves. Yeah, of course, it's a sort of traditional belief that Finns, or maybe the Nordics, are usually sort of quite serious and matter of fact and pragmatic and so on, and that we should have more sort of free-form social activities. And well, sure, but I can't see any problem really, like Fredrik was saying, that when you go to a cafe, that you get people who are between 25 and 45 or whatever. And that's true in Finland, certainly. And I think the problem is not so much sort of communicating as such, but communicating between different groups, like age groups, social groups, and so on. And I think that might be a handicap in Finnish and maybe also Swedish sort of communication culture compared with like Southern Europe and other cultures where you had where it's quite common that 3 generations are together. If you go to a restaurant, I mean, you have parents, children, and the nonna in Italy, and this doesn't happen in Finland. It's pretty rare, and I'm not sure what.
Reflecting also in the way how people are engaging more in the society and with do you see those kind of divisions also, for example, in how people are engaging with the structures? Can you draw any comparisons, or is this something that is just more in the personal realm, this division?
Yeah, I can't really catch that. I think my experience, of course, of other countries or other sort of, especially local politics, is limited because my local politics is in Helsinki. But from what I've seen in other cultures, what I like about like Finnish local politics is the relative, how shall I put it, sort of straightforward clarity of conversation. And usually the political debate, it remains on track, and most of the people talk about the same issue. Yeah. But in many other countries, I mean, it gets sidetracked, and the starting issue sort of breaks out into several other issues, so it doesn't end up in a conclusion. And I think this is what's good about the Nordic political mentality, put it this way, that usually there's one debate about one issue and it doesn't break out into several.
Yeah. No, this is great that you had the time to discuss and tell about the different ways of how you have been creating bridges between citizens and the city, and giving very tangible experiences also, that we can almost see the blizzards and the markets, how this interaction can happen. So I had the pleasure of inviting you here, and we were a little bit late, but we will end in time, so we do something precisely. And thank you very much to the organization of Creative Bureaucracy for having us, and we will definitely keep with Nordic City making the conversation alive. So you can follow us online, and we will publish also more of the coming events and meetups. So thank you, Pekka and Frederick. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.